Of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Before we begin, I ask our two in-person participants to look for the green card in front of you. There's guidelines and measures in place to help prevent audio feedback incidents, to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. There is a QR code on that card as well if you need further instruction. Pursuant to the routine motion adopted by the committee, I can confirm all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of this meeting. We do have some witnesses online today. Welcome. Please wait until I recognize you by name before you speak. All comments should be addressed through the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by this committee on Wednesday, November 5th, 2025, the committee is meeting to study the effects of influencers and social media content on children and adolescents. We have with us today David Morin, full professor from UNESCO. Hello. Chair in the Prevention of Violent Radicalization and Extremism, Université de Sherbrooke. From the Media Ecosystem Observatory, we have Angus Bridgman, Director. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Online, we have Michael Cooper, Vice President of Data and Partnerships from Mental Health Research Canada. Welcome, sir. And Katie Paul, Director of Tech Transparency Project, also online. Welcome. I will note that we have another witness joining us at 5:30, Marie-Eve Carignan, also from UNESCO. We will give her 5 minutes to speak when she arrives at 5:30 as well. But starting now, each delegation, each witness has 5 minutes to give us some opening remarks. We'll start with you, Mr. Morin. 5 minutes starting now. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for inviting me to come here and speak to you today about a very specific aspect of social networks, which is one of the negative sides of it, the link between exposure to hateful material and violence. It would be unfortunate not to begin by underscoring the fact that social media are very positive in some respects, often very useful and positive for young people. But today I will speak to a specific aspect of social media. It's linked to violent extremism. 3 good examples in Canada. First, a young person arrested in Nova Scotia and accused of juvenile pornography, who was sort of working within a network that glorifies cruelty and violence with reference to Nazism. The 745 movement online that recruits young people to carry out violence, including mutilation and death by suicide. And this group recruits a good deal on social media and very young children as well. Another example, a young jihadist arrested this summer in Montreal regarding the Israel-Gaza issues and preparing young people to become actively violent, which reminds us that such communities do play an important role for such terrorist organizations. My third example is that of Petra Gordon MacDonald, known as Dark Foreigner, who was found guilty to a prison sentence for hateful propaganda, far right, for the group Division Atomwaffen. This is another group that's very present on social media, and it's one of the terrorist entities listed in Canada, reminding us that the far right, along with many other groups, including those in the United States, have understood how important social media can be to share their messages. So quickly, what are the current trends? I would like to underscore 3 aspects of the trends, reminding us first that the social media tend to recruit polarization, recruiting younger and younger youth. So we have a whole group of young people who are being radicalized via the internet and in short order. Second, there are mainstream social media used as an entry point to the event, send young people toward more violent content on alternative platforms. That's an important point, the entry point. The third point I'd like to underscore, young people are using video games, and these are being employed to recruit youth into all sorts of violent extremist activities. My last issue here is generative IA, which will make it even easier for these extremist groups to radicalize youth. So the eventual effects of all this for youth, I would like to tell you about the reviews we have, what the data tells us. The data shows that right now exposure to this type of content seems to be linked to radicalization, whatever the social media used. And exposure to such material also seems to be linked to extremist behavior, not only in the virtual sphere, but also in real life. That has to be underscored. My last point, then, is that exposure to hate content on the internet is not the only issue. We also have to keep in mind the other factors involved in radicalization, personal crises, mental health issues, belonging to a radical group, and so on and so forth. So, yes, the data shows today that there is an effect on social attitudes when you are exposed to hate material online. It makes it more likely that you have a mental health issue, that you're less likely to contribute positively to society and contribute to conflict and violence. So I remind us of what goes on in Canada. According to Statistics Canada, in 2022, 71% of young people from 16 to 24 years of age stated that they had found hateful material online. And according to the police, about a third of victims of hateful cybercrime were less than 25 years of age. The RCMP also says that between April and March 2024, 25 people were accused of terrorism, and 7 of those were minors. That being the context, statu quo is unacceptable. So our idea is not necessarily to be punitive and to overly constraining. There are examples, let's say, in Australia and Europe of attempts to take things into state hands, but it has to be done, but in a targeted manner. And that's what we suggest, ensuring that the platforms themselves are made responsible and then working with other social elements to prevent and to raise awareness. Winding up, I underscore that it's very important for lawmakers to remain responsible in this issue, not to increase polarization in our society, which, of course, doesn't mean that they can't discuss important issues and carry out political debate. So I thank you for your initiative today, which is assuredly another step in the right direction. Thank you.
Vous?
Thank you very much. And now we will hear Mr. Bridgman.
You have the floor now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I want to open by just saying my expertise is as a scholar of the information ecosystem and of the overall information environment. I'm not an expert on children or youth, but nevertheless, our studies of influencers and of the information environment I find are very pertinent for this study and very pertinent for this committee. Recently, we ran a study looking at the rise of influencers in Canada. We know now, amongst sort of the youngest cohort that we're able to survey, that over 4/5 of Canadians, so 81% of youth, are getting their news typically from influencers now. They're getting their news, their political information, their entertainment content. That is the source of their political and social life. That is at its base. This has enormous repercussions for our political reality and for the training of youth into the political process. I want to highlight sort of 2 major findings from that recent influencer study that I think kind of are particularly pertinent. The first is the way influencers spread and the way that they come to appear on the screens of youth here in Canada. The primary way that influencers reach new listeners, new adherents, are through the recommendation algorithm. It is not through explicit preference. It is not through social relationships. It is through the algorithm. So in your day-to-day behavior on social media, it is the platform itself which is determining what you see and not any intentionality. This reduction in intentionality in the way particularly youth consume and think about information is enormously important, and we haven't really appreciated the consequence of it. If we think back to 20, 30 years ago, the way you chose to get your information, where you got your information was very much about a choice you would make. You would go out and you would make a decision for a paper, for a TV channel, for people to talk to. It is not so today. For the youth of today, your choice is the platform. And in some ways, that is determined by your social status, by your friend group. And then once on the platform, your choices are much less important than your behaviors, than your actions that you don't even know you're necessarily engaging in. And so that loss of intention is enormously important for political and cultural socialization. So that's number one. Number two is influencers are now central to the political conversation. They make up the majority of engagement. The majority of kind of Canadian eyeballs that see political content online are now seeing influencer content. We have a system, a set of norms and rules around speech, around disclosure, around transparency that grew up in an era where influencers didn't exist and where it was unimaginable that a private citizen, with a telephone in their bedroom would be able to reach millions of Canadians. But that is the state we are in right now, and our regulatory kind of approach, particularly during elections, but outside elections as well, is completely unprepared and not sort of is ill-adapted to the new reality. So those are sort of two findings from that study. I have kind of three recommendations for this study. The first is, this is what it is. This is not a phenomena unique to Canada. Influencers, social media are now the primary source of social life for youth. Any policy or approach that doesn't take adequate account for that is doomed to fail. We need to operate within that regime. We need to operate within this idea that youth like their social media. They want to continue to use it, and we can better protect them. We can better encadrer that space, but it is what it is. Second, algorithmic discovery is the key mechanism and the key way this stuff is shared. That algorithmic discovery is not a neutral process. It is a process by which platforms have made a series of choices about what content gets amplified and shared and which influencers are seen. The idea is they would like you to think that there is no decision, that it is some black box that has no control. But it is not the case. There are decisions behind that, and that is sort of one of the key levers available. The last thing I want to leave you with is that, look, the line between entertainment, culture, community, and political information has never been blurrier. And for youth today, in their day-to-day consumption of information, politics, entertainment, culture, TikTok dances are all intermeshed and together. That creates an environment where they can become incredibly informed, but it also creates some dangers. And some of these dangers are that our media literacy training programs, the way we have taught people to consume news in this country, is completely ill-adapted for an environment where all of this is blended together. So I urge as well sort of this committee to reflect and to account for that. I'll leave it there.
Perfect timing, thank you. And we'll go online now. Michael Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Mental Health Research Canada.
Well, thank you for having me, and my apologies, I could not be there in person. I would have liked to be very much. Again, my name is Michael Cooper. I'm the Vice President of Data and Partnerships here at Mental Health Research Canada. We have been funded to collect ongoing trackers of mental health indicators since 2020 as a pandemic response, and since that time, we've evolved to include a number of cross-sectional issues that intersect mental health, and I can share a few with them here today. Specifically, I want to share a few things that I've learned about specifically 16 and older, so we don't collect any data for anyone under the age of 16. I can speak to a little bit of other research on that topic. Sorry, my phone was ringing. So I want to specifically mention that we've been tracking online gambling, specifically among youth, and the algorithm showing a lot of information about that particular issue and how that's driving problematic gambling. I'm also can speak a little bit about screen time. And one of the things we've been tracking is the volume of screen time. And we have identified that a number of youth, and it's essentially for anyone who consumes more than 6 hours of personal screen time a day, there are significant mental health implications from anxiety, depression, suicide ideation. We've published some reporting on that. And the other issue, and of course for youth 16 to 24, we see that they are the group that is the most likely to spend more than 6 hours on screen time a day. Therefore, they would be the ones most impacted by them, these indicators. The other issue I wanted to speak a little bit about is we have tracked specifically social media, and we've tracked what youth are doing on social media, what sort of activities from cyberbullying, what their experiences have been along the lines of FOMO, fear of missing out, or whether or not they're experiencing issues around comparing themselves to others as well. So I've put together a deck and I've sent it along to this group. And if you're interested in asking any questions about that specifically, I do want to speak on a few other issues that are more general around mental health, specifically to social media, where we would say that we've been tracking long-term trends since the 1970s on mental health, and we have indicators that have tracked that since that time. They're not clinical in nature, but they do track general mental health indicators. And we did see a significant shift in about 2004 for a lot of these youth in terms of their mental health, which would have corresponded to when a lot of these smartphones would have ended up in individuals' hands. We did see another movement again in 2020 through the pandemic and not recovery since that time as well too. So I just wanted to highlight this is another area of research that we are privy to as well. I wanted to highlight the social connection aspect of it. Individuals who are more connected to their community, to family, to loved ones are far more likely to have positive mental health indicators to seek out help. We do know that for a number of individuals that the experience they're having online through social media is shallow and not necessarily engaging with outside individuals, which could be one of those reasons that their mental health is poorer if they're spending so much time on social media. And the other thing I wanted to speak to very quickly was this idea of influencers. I do not track influencers. However, I am a vast consumer of research, and I know that there's a tremendous amount of research that exists understanding how youth process, especially advertising. We have this from past studies on concerned children's advertisers. We have a great amount of data on this. So we know that youth are not fully developed in terms of their ability to discern between informational content and selling content. We also know that it becomes especially blurry if the line is blurred. So if there's not a price tag at the end of an ad, most youth would not be able to identify that in terms of that it is in fact in advertising. So when I think about influencers, I'm thinking about the fact that a lot of these influencers are being used to sell products to youth, essentially circumventing a lot of these concerned children advertisers laws that we've had over a period of time. So I'm more than happy to speak to any of these topics. These would be areas that we have data and expertise in. I probably have 300 stats on these issues, so I don't want to just throw numbers at you, but I can assure you that we are tracking these issues and other issues, body dysmorphia, so eating disorders. We do know that about 1 in 4 young women are experiencing high risk of eating disorders. A lot of that does tie into social media as well too, where we're seeing connections with those high social media use as well too. So lots of very troubling statistics around what's happening in mental health as it pertains to social media and for youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm coming up with lots of questions after the testimony we've had so far today. Katie Paul from the Tech Transparency Project, you are up next. You have 5 minutes, starting now.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today about the impacts of social media on young people. My name's Katie Paul, and I'm the director of the nonprofit Tech Transparency Project in Washington, D.C. We are a nonpartisan research organization that investigates the influence and impact of big tech on the public. Our research has found that big tech platforms have not only amplified harm to children, but often profited in the process. Recent reports from a multi-district lawsuit in the United States reveal that big tech companies like Meta and YouTube are internally aware of the potential harms of their content on children based on their own research. That research was then buried by the companies so they could continue to profit from that harm. The revelations from the lawsuit track with years of research from the Tech Transparency Project. Our investigations in 2021 and 2022 found widespread drug trafficking on Instagram that was algorithmically pushed to accounts for users under the age of 16. Meta's platform design and algorithms make it easier for kids to contact drug dealers than to log off of the platform. The study found that while it only takes 2 clicks for a teen to find and connect with a drug dealer on Instagram, it takes 5 clicks to log out of the platform. Instagram's automated technologies also undermine the company's own efforts to address drugs. For instance, while Instagram banned hashtags for popular drugs like MDMA, its search autofill recommended alternative hashtags for those drugs, driving kids directly toward dealers. The problem isn't just platform design. Meta also directly profits from pushing drugs to users on its platform. A series of TTP investigations found that Facebook routinely approved ads pushing pill parties, alcohol, gambling, and vaping, as well as extreme weight loss to kids under the age of 18. Meta's primary business model relies on advertising. It's the company's main product, but has little oversight and quality control. Meta does little to implement safety when it comes to ads. In July of last year, our organization published a report that found Meta has run hundreds of ads for deadly drugs like cocaine and fentanyl. These ads are not simply content posted by third parties. Meta has reviewed, approved, and is profiting from these advertisements. These kind of advertisements continue today, as was reported by the Toronto Star in a recent investigation. And the problem isn't limited to ads for drugs. In October of last year, TTP found that Meta was also running hundreds of ads for weapons, and in some cases amounting to international arms trafficking. These were not ads for big box stores or local gun dealers. They were illicit ads selling ghost guns, fully automatic weapons, and illegal gun parts. These ads not only help put illegal trafficked weapons into the hands of people across North America, they also undermine the business of legitimate licensed gun dealers. Ads for both guns and drugs follow the same pattern. They feature an image or a video of the illicit content and link to a private messaging service like Telegram or WhatsApp, which is also owned by Meta, to conduct transactions. But Meta is perhaps the most critical piece of this puzzle. These dealers buy ads from Meta to get their product in front of as many people as possible. They could not attain this reach without the help of Facebook or Instagram. While these social media and tech companies are aware of the harms of their platforms, they don't take action to mitigate those harms until after the potential consequences have been raised. Companies like OpenAI, which is facing a major lawsuit for its AI chatbot's role in teen suicide, created a teen version of the chatbot only after it was sued by the family of Adam Rain, following ChatGPT's AI chatbot providing instructions on how to make a noose and encouraging the Rain to commit suicide. In 2024, Meta launched its teen Instagram accounts, holding up the feature as a move for parents to help keep kids safe and on the platform that they fail to effectively moderate. The move was largely part of a broader effort by Meta to stave off the implications of civil lawsuits and a wave of pending regulations from lawmakers in the U.S. and abroad. What Meta had pitched as new features to keep teens safe was simply a repackaging of things the company had already claimed it was implementing years earlier. TTP recently tested these accounts and found that the content Meta had claimed was barred from teens, notably graphic content and fight content, was served readily to teen accounts despite the heavily promoted claims of protections. This continues today. As companies like Meta have come under pressure, they have funded organizations like Connect Safely and the National PTA to ensure they launder their narrative through paid allies. These social media companies and chatbots are among the most well-resourced and technologically advanced in the world, but those profits have been built on decades of harm to children that the companies are aware of but take no action to address unless faced with the potential of repercussions. They have the capital and capabilities, but have proven time and again they cannot be trusted to act in good faith, and it's imperative for national governments to effectively regulate these companies for their role in profiting from the harms to the most vulnerable populations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now turn to members for questions, starting with Mrs. Thomas for 6 minutes.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses for taking the opportunity to be with us here today. Much appreciated. My first question is going to go to you, Ms. Paul. I'm interested in, you said that big tech companies such as Meta, they profit from these ads that are, advertising illicit drugs or weapons or gambling to underage individuals. For us to have a better understanding of this, would you have examples of these ads that you could supply to the committee so that we could see what they look like?
Yes, I had submitted a write-up of the testimony with lots of links to citations, including our report, which has multiple slideshows on the ads with regard to drugs, weapons, as well as the teen ad account tests that we ran over a 3-year period, and the ads that were submitted and approved by the platform for those.
Perfect. Okay, my apologies that I have not seen that. I was just told that it is in translation, which is why I have not yet received it. So I look forward to being able to review that. Thank you so much for sending that our way, Ms. Paul. My next question is going to Mr. Morin. I understand you've done quite a bit of research with regards to radicalization of young people. And so my question to you is, last month, the CSIS director, Dan Rogers, he warned about hateful ideologies, including anti-Semitism. And what I would love to know from you, what he said was that that young people are being radicalized in a dangerous way, and that this has been amplified since October 7th. And so I'm curious from you if you can explain what is the link between anti-Semitism and radicalization here in Canada, and what can be done about that?
Vous me donnez une demi-heure pour répondre.
That would take me half an hour to give you a full answer. But look, thank you very much for that question. Yes, indeed, what we do observe in the ecosystems in which we're carrying out research since the 7th of October attack, there is a convergence between hate speech targeting the Jewish community, which is often associated with the government of Israel without any care taken in how that link is made. I'm not going to give you names here, of course, but there are groups here in Canada, I would say radical Islamic groups, and there are some in Quebec, a few people who are important players now trying to capitalize on the feeling of injustice and anger among some youth regarding the Gaza situation, to use that to sell a sort of a discourse which insists on the presumed incompatibility between practicing Islam and living in the West. So this is an attempt to radicalize some of our youth. Thus, it's important, as I said in my conclusion, to ensure that we speak clearly in all political matters and to not increase disagreements. And there are indeed some mainstream groups now. Some are in accessible social media, some are on alternative social media that have a serious reach, even though they're rather specific. I'm not sure if I gave you the names you'd recognize them, but yes, indeed. Anti-Semitism, in and of itself, as you know, it was well present before the 7th of October, and anti-Semitism is a feature, unfortunately, of many societies and has been for some time, but this conflict seems to be reactivating it. So when it comes to dealing with this hate speech, we see that there's more of it to be dealt with now. Hate targeting the Jewish community as of a few years now. It seems to be setting in and not reducing. I hope that's an efficient answer.
I think that's a good start. I guess I'm curious, can you break down further as to how social media platforms are used to enhance that radicalization of young people or that pursuit of young people for the purposes of radicalization?
Les réseaux sociaux font plusieurs choses. Donc d'abord,
social media have a broad effect. They allow for reaching a broader public, and my colleagues have pointed this out. You can target specific groups in virtual space where there may be youth, let's say, enjoying war games online, and they can be reached with chat functions. They can be reached directly, entered into contact with. They can be asked questions about their political points of view, their lived experience, and the more vulnerable are targeted and radicalized. This is something we've seen with the Islamic State. ISIS, which invented, if I can say, a type of approach that allowed them, even on social media, to identify people and encourage people to commit violent activities, even though they might not have been involved in such things before. And as I say, social media are one tool among many others in the toolboxes of terrorist organizations. I wouldn't like us to think otherwise. You know, a lot of people are on social media and luckily are not being radicalized, but nevertheless, among those who are radicalized, they are using a lot of social media. This is something that is found universally in all research focused on radicalization. So social media has this ability to find people, to reach them, and there are so many encrypted platforms that allow them to exchange information. There's also funds, digital funds that are used to fund terrorist groups, and so all of this works together.
Mr. Al-Sood, you're next for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for those opening remarks and for being with us. I asked a little about this on Monday, and I thought the response was extremely interesting. So I'd like to focus a little on the parasocial relationship between influencers and young consumers. Many adolescents follow celebrities like Drake and other top streamers who openly promote online gambling platforms. Even when platforms claim to restrict access to minors, the content itself is watched primarily by youth. Based on your expertise, how concerned should we be that gambling-style content is normalizing high-risk gambling behavior among children and teens? I opened this question up a little bit, but I know, Mr. Cooper, that MHRC has previously considered this impact of gambling at large. I'd welcome your thoughts.
Happy to get started on this. So, as you know, gambling is illegal for those under 18. We did not ask about that specifically. What we can identify is that there are tremendous amounts of bendings of the rules. Typically, Ontario has been the one who's legalized single sports betting, but we're seeing that coming in from every province. And of course, they're not legal in those provinces. In some provinces you go into and they're running ads saying, don't gamble on these Bet365, but bet on our local platforms. One thing, there's some great work that's coming out of UBC. There's a Center for Gambling out there. Dr. Bruce, I believe is his name, and he's done a lot of work looking at the neurology as to what's happening with youth and specifically gambling-like activities. And I would think along the lines of Roblox and going in there and getting a randomized loot box and then buying that and getting some random item inside that, or going in Call of Duty or some video game and getting a randomized loot box. And it's essentially the same dopamine hit you get when you get that sort of experience. So you're essentially participating in a gambling adjacent activity, and these are available at any age. There's even reports coming in that we're seeing in some other countries as well, where you're taking artificial currencies like Robux, and they're actually able to participate and gamble their currency in Robux, and it's not regulated because it's not a legal currency. So there's lots of ways that organizations are getting around this. We do know that youth are being inundated with ads for these sorts of things, and it is essentially rewiring their brains for both expectations, what they're prepared to do. It's basically legalized gambling. I'll stop now because I'm sure other providers want to answer that as well.
Actually, your audio cut out there for a little bit, so I was going to cut you off, but hopefully we all heard that answer. We were good with translation. All right, you still have several minutes. Sorry, Mr. Al-Sood.
Fantastic. Would anyone else like to add to that before I jump into my next question? It seems not. Perfect. Touching on this exact piece of loot boxes, I'm quite interested. Do you believe Canada needs age-appropriate design rules or restrictions targeted specifically at gambling-style content? So that's separate from traditional gambling legislation.
So if I could jump in there very quickly, there is again, we study 16 and up, so there wasn't a huge.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cooper, your audio is not working for us. We're going to have somebody call you to try and fix that problem.
Happy to jump into a separate question if you'd like, but if I could ask, how much time do I have left?
I'll pause the time for this,
Perfect.
So you've got 3 minutes.
Fantastic. Madame Tessier-Bouchard, en tant que média...
Ms. Tessier-Bouchard, Ms. Tessie Bouchard is not here. I'm so sorry. Let me say Ms. Tessie Bouchard isn't here, but I just want to ask a question. We were told that you suspended the previous questioner. Are we waiting for Mr. Cooper's sound issue to be solved, or I will begin the time and allow him to start his question period again. I could suspend for a moment. Well, I'm just for Mr. Al-Soud. I want to ensure that his questions to Mr. Cooper can be answered. I want to see if Mr. Al-Soud wants to ensure that Mr. Cooper be in a position to answer his questions or if he just wishes to go on and ask other questions. I would prefer to put my questions to Mr. Cooper, but if the sound isn't working, that's fine. I can put questions to other witnesses.
Okay, perfect. Then we don't have to discuss it any further.
Parfait.
Go ahead.
Loot boxes.
I apologize. The light went out on the little USB thing, so I think. Oh. Can you? Can you hear me?
Go ahead. I'll let you know if your audio cuts out again.
All right, thank you. The light's flickering on and off on my USB piece here. So if you can't hear me, let me know. But yeah, my headset seems to be breaking down. So the answer is we look at capture rates. Only about 2% of Canadians over the age of 16 are actually participating in loot boxes. Unfortunately, what we found is about half of the people who participate in loot boxes over the age of 16 are actually experiencing what the PGSI, which is a problematic gambling indicator. So it is an extremely addictive behavior. At this point, it's not widespread among the Canadian population, but if it were to expand, it is one of the most addictive things that we are seeing among all type of gambling activities. Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Paul, I'd like to follow up on your opening remarks. You noted a degree of dishonesty by certain platforms. I think I'm being modest in that assessment. I think of Kick that has become a major platform, and it's mostly because it is welcoming of gambling streams. Twitch, it's imperfect, but has adopted stronger restrictions and moderation policies. I'm curious, what does the divergence between Kick and Twitch tell us about the competitiveness pressure to reduce moderation to attract audience? Certainly, I think of Meta and the pressures there.
Well, I will note that Kick is not a platform that we focus on because we do focus on the largest platforms that have the that are of most consequence to general populations. That said, we have done some research on Twitch, although not related to gambling, but entities that are monetizing Russian propaganda regarding the Ukraine war. But one of the things that we've seen largely when you look at the social media platforms that Pew Research, for instance, has shown are the most popular among teens, which is Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. These are platforms that largely we do not see a lot of effective moderation, particularly platforms like Instagram. Instagram is one of the platforms that we ran test ads targeting teens for gambling, and every single one of those ads was approved, including ones that we were able to generate the images with Meta's own AI tool. These are companies that make very specific claims about their policies banning this kind of content, particularly in advertising, but we do not see that actually practiced effectively by the platforms.
Madam Chair, once more, my time.
Sorry. Monsieur Champoux, 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
You have 6 minutes. Mr. Champoux, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing your knowledge and your point of view on this very sensitive and very interesting topic. Mr. Morin, a number of things have been said by you and by other witnesses, and I'll try to gather together all this to put useful questions to you. You said you would need half an hour to answer my colleague's question, and I would love having that time. But in your opening statement, you spoke mostly of the age of young people who are being radicalized. Younger and younger, you were saying. And Ms. Thomas also had you touch on this, asking how this works, what's the procedure, and we also mentioned games, Roblox, and so on, that allow young people to converse among themselves. over the social networks that they're using. And I imagine that's a very active interaction. But tell us a little bit more about the process. Many of us are parents and worried. How can we follow these changes? How best to remain vigilant? What is the process itself? How does an organization go about reaching young people to radicalize them? Thank you very much for your question. The process, criteria one, is the number of hours that children spend on social network, even though that's not necessarily a good indicator. It might be an indicator of their mental health, but not necessarily of radicalization. What is a useful factor is social isolation. Psychological distress, their behavior changing radically, not speaking to or seeing the same friends, not tolerating contradictions in conversation, and so on. But there again, there are many false positives among those criteria. I mean, these sorts of things can happen around the dinner table. My daughter doesn't always agree with me, and she's not being radicalized. But we, of course, are looking at violent extremism and violent acting out. But I'd ask you to step back and to consider before that one of the negative effects of social media today, and this was indeed underscored by my colleagues, is the business model of many of these social media platforms in the socio-political space, at least. What we see is clashing, confrontation, no more debate, people closing down into their own little bubbles. And I think that this becomes a problem for society. Monday, I was providing testimony to another committee regarding anti-feminist discourse. And are good examples. Andrew Tate, for example, a very prominent influencer. Such discourse on social media leads to there being now many young men who really have a very regressive view of male-female relationships and who actually enter into relationships with very bizarre attitudes which are no longer aligned with the expectations of women today and young women today. There are very disturbing statistics. I think it's about 40%, more than 40% of young men think that feminism is a woman's strategy that they are using to control society. And about the same group of men feel that men and women are now on equal footing, therefore feminism is no longer at all relevant. So, you see, over and beyond violent extremism, and we do have special CSIS and so on dealing with that, but overall, as a society, we have a major issue with youth. And after the Christchurch killings, I'm not going to remind you of those because I'm sure you're aware of them, a number of platforms and governments got together to try to better moderate content. I remind you, of course, that a man was able to massacre 60 people, Muslims, practitioners, and filmed the whole thing, and it was actually broadcast live. But now we observe that a number of the players are actually no longer moving forward to moderate appropriately, such as on Twitter. That was long. No, that's very justified. My questions are long, and your answers are much more interesting than my questions are. But I do understand what you said, and I admit that it's very difficult to convince the platforms to cooperate with this. We've heard others mentioned the business model, which sort of encourages this sort of illicit trade that they're profiting from. But as lawmakers, couldn't we with bad influencers or with these sorts of predators that can often be identified online, like the 764 movement. And, there is this anti-terrorist list we have in Canada. Couldn't we apply this, use this without necessarily constraining the platforms over and beyond insisting that they allow us to trace these people, that Canada have a better list, a broader list of people who are carrying out illegal activities? Would this be a good idea? Being on the Canadian anti-terrorist list, of course, provides legal enforcement a good tool to work with. You have influencers, and there are small movements, of course, that are recruiting. It's not necessarily always the large organizations that are designated as terrorist. So that's the issue now. A disclaimer, though. I was a member of the expert group that provided advice to the Government of Canada in matters of moderating harmful material online for Bill C-63. I do think that that bill was a good basis to work from. It's a bill. It needs, of course, to be amended and improved, but it's already a good text that can be worked on. And it covered three elements: making platforms responsible for withdrawing content and for demonstrating that it has done so or would have done so, will be doing so. And it also designated a commissioner able to verify that content had been withdrawn. And also the platforms had to provide material to data. And then third, an ombudsman. Very important. We all want to ensure that freedom of speech is respected, and the commissioner would have a role in ensuring that that be maintained, really. So I think all this was very positive. A number of other countries do this: Australia, the UK, Europe. Of course, Canadians are in a special situation because the Americans are just south and are putting a lot of pressure on Canada to avoid this type of intervention. But I think going forward, this is the right way to moderate. Thank you, Mr. Janil. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Bridgman, you mentioned 80% of influencers. Well, 80% of people get their news from influencers. So what news are we speaking of here? Public news, political news, or what? Just general or things that are focused on youth, these influencers, 80%. I mean, I'm older, but I do still watch TV sometimes. I do use a bit of social media. Clearly, I'm showing my age here. That being said, we do have our, habits. So what exactly are you referring to with these percentages? Yes, when I said 80%, when I say 80%, I mean that 80% of youth, and that's people between 18 and 34 years of age. 34, it's not necessarily youth, but it's still a younger person. So 80% of them regularly engage with online influencers and use their content, their product, generally speaking. And they also consume, if you wish, their opinions of these influencers on day-to-day politics, on the political space. If you read the written print press or watch TV, that's another matter. But if you're on social media, most of the information you're getting every single day is coming through influencers. It's not really just traditional media giving you facts. An influencer, yes, provides facts, but also provides an interpretation, what they think it means in the political space. A trend, considering data now, it seems that young people seem to be more to the right of the political spectrum than their elders are. Are there more influencers who are, more on the right, if you wish, politically? Is that the case? Yes, this is a very recent phenomenon, having youth on the right of the political spectrum. It wasn't the case a few years ago. Yes, indeed, the studies carried out, that we've carried out, and this is pretty much everywhere, truly show that at this point, online, everything's more on the right. It's not just on X. Of course, on X, the linkage to more conservative voices is more pronounced, but not only there. And this is a complex phenomena. In general, though, people at the center or to the left tend to trust traditional media. If you're to the left, you spend some time on traditional media and some time with influencers and on social media. But if you're to the right, you tend to distrust traditional standard media and you spend all your time on social media. And that gives some weight to those platforms and to the voice of the right. There was a Media Matters study in the United States showing that among the most important influencers in the United States, and Canadians use them as well, most of them are to the right of the political spectrum, and that's the case everywhere. Mr. Morin. Yes, let me add something. Our data shows, and we have just carried out a survey of over 6,600 people. When we say that young people are to the right, you really have to state that there's a big difference between men and women. It's really by gender. The responses are very different, and the young women seem to be clearly to the left on a number of issues, social issues. And then when we say that young men are more to the right, it's not necessarily a majority of them. It's just that there are more of them now who are on the right. They're not yet the majority, though. And when people answer the surveys and so on, this is what we see. So I just want to underscore that. Indeed, now, on digital social media, we do observe, and I was saying this earlier, given how these social media work, well, they tend to favor a number of influencers to the right in their view of political issue. And I'm not being judgmental here. I'm not partisan. But I think that the right in the United States, and I said this in my opening statement, quickly understood how to make good use of digital social media and use it in a very relevant way to interest young people in their projects. We saw this with the Charlie Kirk issue. He was able to mobilize some of the American conservative right. Do I have a little time left? Thank you.
Welcome to Heritage Committee. You have the floor now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, colleagues, for having me today. And thank you to our witnesses for sharing your expertise with us today. Alarming stuff, but important for us to hear, and I appreciate your time. My question to start is for anybody, but perhaps Mr. Bridgman might have an answer. I'm curious if there's a standard definition for an influencer. How do we determine the threshold that separates an influencer, per se, from anybody online with opinions?
It's an excellent question, and I'm going to give a data-driven definition. And sort of our work, what we really look at is we're primarily concerned with political influencers and political influence. But what we're looking for is people with a large following who share their opinions online and who trade in the currency of, for better or worse, authenticity. So it's somebody who is speaking from their voice, who spends the majority of their time talking about politics. And we sort of have a threshold depending on platform, but we sort of set the bar in the Canadian context at about 10,000 followers. So if you have 10,000 followers and above, and you're primarily producing political content, you get kind of labeled as an influencer. Various studies have different definitions, but this is kind of the general thing. Are you focusing on political content? Do you have a certain number of followers, and are you speaking on behalf of yourself and with your authentic voice, as opposed to an institutional or organizational perspective?
Excellent. Monsieur Morin, est-ce que vous êtes en accord avec cette définition?
Do you agree with that definition, Mr. Morin? One must never contradict a colleague, especially among university specialists, and we mustn't get into a conceptual discussion or you'll all fall asleep.
Same vein, I'm curious if either of you are either aware of any research or have conducted research yourself on what's the ideological orientation of this body of influencers. Do we see a particular tendency in terms of particular places on the political spectrum, or is it not that clear cut?
It's certain. It's certain that there is a wide variety of perspective. Influencers are a very diverse group. In a recent study, we did examine kind of the Canadian influencer map. We were looking at over 1,000 of prominent influencers in the Canadian context. And one of the striking things about the Canadian context is there's absolutely ideological divide. But actually the largest divide that we found in sort of our analysis was about the types of content that people focused on. And so what we were trying to model is how often people engage in conversations with one another. So having a perspective is one thing. We all have a perspective in politics. But are you actually talking to somebody else about issues that you care about? And is there that dialogue happening? And what we found is in the Canadian context, there certainly is a distinctive, smaller right-wing cluster that does not really have a parallel on the left. There are a few, but it's much smaller. But the vast majority of engagement and attention is sort of this core set of influencers that is really responding to the day-to-day of politics and is really generating sort of that conversation from their perspective, but often bringing nuance and interpretation and not bringing that ideological forward approach. So in some ways, this was very heartening for us in the study. Over and over again, social media studies have demonstrated deep polarization in online spaces, and that absolutely exists, and there are echo chambers. But in the Canadian context, it does seem that there is sort of this core, and I'm sure many of the names are familiar to this committee, that actually just respond to the political news of the day and share their hot take.
Thank you. And so maybe, continuing on the theme of your remarks, Mr. Bridgman, you used an interesting phrase during your opening statement. You referred to the loss of intention which comes by the algorithmic nature of these platforms. I think, if we think back, there was a lot of optimism about the kind of increase in freedom that the internet and social media might bring to individuals, the democratization of information, et cetera. Your comments and, of course, many other indicators suggest that that might be a little bit of a misleading understanding of the current context, especially given the presence or the role of these very large tech companies in dominating this space. Would you agree with the assessment that having 81% of youth getting their news from social media and social media being dominated by a small number of large companies, does that actually increase or restrict the freedom to access information that individuals in our society might enjoy?
I'm deeply concerned about the ability of individuals to access information. I think it is part of it is partly because of the algorithmic filtering. It is partly as well because of the isolation that occurs in online spaces. And I think about the radicalization stuff. People seek connection online, but often find isolation. And what I mean by isolation is ideological isolation. Isolation in terms of a particular community where you lose that broader perspective. And I think this can happen, and thank you for picking up on the intention comment, because I think this is one of the defining features of our current information environment, is the ceding of intention, the ceding of agency to social algorithms. And what's remarkable is that Canadians really don't trust social media platforms. They don't trust social media platforms to act in the public good, and for many of the reasons that some of my colleagues sort of highlighted. They say that, but actually their behavior, their day-to-day behavior, the way they engage on the platforms, actually they place enormous trust in the algorithm to show them what they did. And you see this repeatedly, particularly on TikTok. The explosive growth of TikTok is exactly because people believe that the algorithm is showing things that they need to see. And untangling that is going to be kind of critical to moving forward on this problem and to addressing what I think is a information-seeking agency crisis in the country.
More and more questions all the time. Very interesting testimony today. Monsieur Champoux, pour 2 minutes et demie.
C'est vrai qu'on trouve plus de questions.
You have 2.5 minutes, Mr. Champoux. It looks like we're finding more questions than answers, but this is at least in the right direction. Back to you, Mr. Morin. Earlier, we were discussing a number of areas of radicalization, methods that are used, masculinization of people, radicalization in general, and you also spoke of what you shared with another committee earlier this week regarding feminism. What are some of the other trends that are popular among these manipulators, and are we able to first observe and then even foresee these trends in order to equip our youth to avoid them? You saw this summer 4 people who were arrested. 2 were members of the Canadian Armed Forces, and this is one of the real concerns of intelligence agencies here in Canada, the far-right extremism, anti-government violence. There's a good deal of overlap there. It's a source of real concern for our public safety. There's a good deal of resistance to social institutions and so on. So that's a very present movement in the Western social media space as of the last decade, I would say, and in North America of considerable concern. As concerning as the jihadist threat, at least in the view of intelligence agencies. Difficult to prevent all this. I would like to add something in response to your question and also to pick up on a prior question. We examine influencers and radical ecosystems and see that there's a bit of the reproduction of the two solitudes of Canada. There's a Francophone ecosystem and an Anglophone ecosystem. The English one is highly influenced by the major Tucker Carlsons and so on, the American influencers, Anglophone, that have a good deal of weight. But the Francophone one in Quebec is linked to influencers in France. During the pandemic, there were a good deal of exchanges, not only virtual, but there were actually people meeting across the Atlantic. And also, there's another trend. Influencers wish to become mainstream, to go mainstream. And these are the radical ones who are looking for space in public space, really. One of the MPs was mentioning using TV, and some of these influencers are also trying to be invited to speak on traditional media, classic mainstream media. Interesting to see that, Bernard, there's hope. Not only old people are watching TV. So I will leave it at that, Madam Chair.
I'm going to just ask another question of my own, because I noted that, Ms. Paul, you talked about the social media algorithms being very intentional with how they're attracting their dollars, right, and how they're using these algorithms to run their business. And for Mr. Bridgman, we heard lots also on algorithms being the key part of the problem. And Mr. Bridgman, you said that it's a key lever that's available to us. But we've had Meta at this table at Heritage Committee. They tell us that their algorithm is their key value proposition, and the government can't touch that. So I'd like perhaps you have some suggestions on what exactly we can do as a Canadian government about these algorithms.
The social media platforms will stand here and say, you can touch nothing about our business model. Nothing about our business model is adjustable to any national government. We are above any single national government. And they will say that repeatedly. And they will say that with regards to ads. They will say, oh, this is an international problem. Oh, this is tricky. Oh, you can't. Okay, fine. That is their perspective. But it is not the perspective that a national government has to take. The stuff that platforms are able to do, the ads that they are able to promote, the complexity of their systems has made them feel invulnerable and ungovernable in this day and age. And I think countries around the world have struggled with governance, and we are starting to see some of these pieces fall into line. Next week in Australia, an under-16 social media ban is going into effect. This is a very sort of far-reaching, and it's going to be very interesting, and I strongly encourage the committee to sort of evaluate how that goes and what it's very pertinent to this subject of study. But these things are absolutely controlled by dials and switches and decisions within these platforms, and they are very responsive to different governments who impose fines, who impose incentives. And I think this is kind of the one thing that I really would like to emphasize is the way internally to these companies they're gonna think about this is, what is the cost to implementing a solution here? What is the cost to an algorithmic change? What is the cost for better screening ads? What is the cost for changing things to? How much engineering time and effort is that going to take? And that is a business decision, and it's a probabilistic business decision. And as a regulator, what you have to do, what you have to think about is, how do I change that knob in the favor of youth health? How do I change that knob in the favor of democratic interest? How do I impose on these platforms a cost associated with bad behavior? And I want to finish this remark by saying, like, I'm old enough, I guess, now to remember Saturday morning cartoons. And Saturday morning cartoons, there were ads on Saturday morning cartoons. If some of the ads that occurred on Meta had been shown on Saturday night cartoons, those TV stations would have been shut down. There would not have been this hand-wringing. If the TV station said, no, that's just our business model, we can't do it, that would have been completely unacceptable. But for some reason, with these large tech platforms, we have ceded this ground. We have said, oh, it's too complicated. And I think we just really need to remind ourselves that Actually, that's a choice. They are governable. They operate within our boundaries. They access an enormous Canadian market. It's incredibly profitable for them. And they will respond to economic incentives to improve their behavior.
Ms. Paul, you have something to add?
Yes, I would really like to echo what Mr. Bridgman said. I think it's critical to understand that these companies are completely capable of addressing these issues and only do so when there are repercussions. For instance, as I mentioned, we see ads for drug trafficking, weapons trafficking on these platforms. We've seen Meta profiting from human smuggling in North America. One of the things we don't see ads for is child sex abuse material, and that's because the legal consequences of even hosting that content are significant. It's proof that the companies are completely capable of addressing these issues and are choosing not to do so when there are not financial or regulatory repercussions. One of the things they like to highlight is the fact that these cost-cutting measures of removing moderators and relying increasingly on AI to become a more financially nimble company. We've seen them fire thousands of content moderators in trust and safety, while at the same time, Meta just offered a historic $250 million contract to a single AI engineer as part of its efforts to poach that engineer from another company. So it's clear that their efforts are not keyed towards safety in any way and maximizing profit at any cost.
Thank you very much. Next, I would like to welcome our next witness to committee, Marie-Yves Carignan, another professor from the Université de Sherbrooke with UNESCO. Welcome. We would like to give you 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for your invitation to appear before you today. Indeed, I'm speaking for the UNESCO Chair in the Prevention of Violent Radicalization and Extremism. I'm a full professor at the University of Sherbrooke. We are concerned by disinformation affecting youth via online content, but the entire population as well. So I think this is an issue that we need to address for all Canadians. A number of forward-looking reports show that disinformation and information are important issues for democratic societies now and into the future, considering the World Economic Forum, which published a report in 2024, and the Council of Canadian Academies in Canada, showing that there will be democratic deficits. People won't be able to tell the difference between the truth and lies, especially given the new arrival of IA. People have more and more difficulty telling what's real and what isn't. Youth are truly affected by this content, often without context, without any perspective, helping them to understand what's real and what isn't. Are there harmful or economic or political interests behind the content that they are exposed to? They don't know. Many young people circumvent the blocks on platform access. It's very difficult to supervise this, to frame this, to manage youth presence on platforms. Parents try to manage the content, but this is a real challenge for parents. They haven't necessarily the tools to help manage youth access to online content, and that attempt to control youth can create family tension, family discomfort. So disinformation is a risk to all. And the Council of Canadian Academies Fault Lines that I contributed to as an expert reports that there are consequences of misinformation for society, for communities, and individually for society. It leads to political polarization, loss of public trust, loss of trust in media, science, and politics, in actions such as climate change in action for communities. It can lead to non-compliance with public health measures during epidemics and with vaccination to prevent disease, resulting in increased healthcare costs and individual consequences as well, leading to illness and even possible death attributable to ineffective or harmful products, resources wasted on ineffective and even dangerous products and services. And of course, this affects youth who become at risk So disinformation and the role of influencers, disinformation actors, is of concern to all Canadians. The Digital News Report 2025 found that 25% of Canadian respondents feel that influencers and web personalities significantly threaten to spread false or misleading information online. And youth are exposed to this risk. There is a Net Tendance 2024 study showing that 45% of 18 to 34-year-olds do follow at least one social influencer. 59% of them actually report following social influencers, and 45% spend over 3 hours a day on social media. So we know that a great number of youth know the names of masculine style influencers online. So social media is difficult to manage, and the ability to apply media literacy is not available to all or used by all. At our chair, we are interested, of course, in media literacy and various initiatives to that effect, such as 30 seconds before making a choice. Journalists in Quebec are working on that. The Ads de l'Information is another group working on this, and there are data showing that such attempts do help youth look for more reliable information, and this can help counter radicalization, ensure that families are able to discuss these matters and able to have more nuanced discussions even among more radicalized parents. And media literacy helps children make choices that keep them in the driver's seat, at least making them aware of the content that they are consuming. Is it professional? Is it journalistic? Is it biased? And who is spreading it? Social media is a vulnerability, of course. Access for young people, they can be exposed to violent acts that can affect them long term. Many studies show that even involuntarily, they come across sexual and violent material online that can desensitize them and lead them to become more radical. A number of groups work that way, going through online games, for example, to reach young people, such as through Kik, that promote violence, gratuitous violence, to make youth accept this. There was a French influencer who actually died online during a video platform live stream in such a situation. So this all becomes recruitment material by malicious groups, extremist, jihadist, organized crime, sexual predation groups, violent groups. There are also cyber criminal networks such as the 764 or the COM groups, targeting 8 to 17-year-olds, inciting them to commit violent acts, including self-harm, to torture and kill animals, to create child sexual exploitation material, or even to die by suicide. These acts are often promoted in escalating levels of intensity. These platforms are sources of harassment and hate speech targeting youth. So we need to deal with this. We need to think through solutions such as funding high-quality information for young people and effective media literacy initiatives, which will help them understand what they're exposed to. Initiatives such as the ones that I mentioned and that we study, such as Les Ads de l'Information. Also, we need to help parents understand their children's online, to understand their children's practices and platforms and sustain communication with them. We need to provide tools to teachers such that they be able to teach media literacy. We need to better regulate platform access for youth and regulate hate speech, violent discourse, and cyberbullying, not only for youth, but for all Canadians, given that this is a matter that affects us all. And to wind up, I think that we need to develop more research activities to identify groups and understand what tactics are best tailored to them, specifically young people, how to work with them. We do need more research to better understand these issues.
Intéressant. Merci beaucoup. Mr. Waugh, I will now give you the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to start first with Ms. Paul, because you're in Washington, D.C. In the last month, we're starting to see more news from the United States, and I'll just, we're seeing court filings now coming out, talking about reduced depression and anxiety among users. We're seeing more and more information that maybe social media platforms were hiding, but all of a sudden they're in front of the U.S. Congress, and now we're seeing in the last month some reports out of there. So your thoughts on this? And I'm not going to name the platforms because they're all covering up, and I just want your views since you are in the nation capital.
Well, one of the things that our organization focuses on beyond just the harms of these platforms, and as you mentioned, the court cases that have really showed how these platforms are covering it up, is the influence that these platforms have, the lobbying that they are engaging in, and how they use third-party groups that they pay to launder their influence and appear to have more voices in support of policies that keep them free from liability for any of the harms that they're profiting from. This is something that I think has been an issue not just in the United States, but we see it all around the world with the way that these companies and the vast influence that they have, not just on politicians, but also on global economies, is something that they wield in order to push for particular policies. And as you mentioned, yes, all of these platforms do have something to hide. I think that one of the things that is critical is to see where they have, which ones have taken efforts to address issues and which have not. For instance, about a decade ago, Google was fined $500 million for illegal online pharmacies that were trafficking opioids. It's much harder to see that kind of content in sponsored ads in Google search, whereas Meta has faced none of those financial repercussions. And we see the company, as of today, continuing to run and approve ads explicitly for dangerous and deadly drugs. These are the kind of things where we can see that pressure and repercussions have made a difference in how the companies operate, and making that a consistent policy across how all of these companies are dealt with is really critical in ensuring safety for all users online.
Okay, the occurrences of exploitation of children. Which social media platforms for youth are most vulnerable? We've had a ton of articles on this in the country, and it's a big one now, the sexual exploitation of children, because money is on the rise. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think for that kind of, to understand that, we need to look at the data and understanding which platforms are most heavily used by children. Instagram, for instance, remains one of the most popular platforms, so much so that several years ago, Instagram actually tried to create a Instagram Kids platform for children under the age of 13, when it has yet to solve any of the harmful problems with regard to not just its existing platform, but even the teen platform that it has since been promoting, as it's facing now civil and regulatory repercussions, or the potential of those repercussions. So I think that looking at the platforms the kids go to the most is important. Also looking at how widely spread these platforms are used. For instance, Kik was mentioned earlier, and while there are issues with that platform, it's of much less consequence in terms of the penetration of usage, as opposed to much more well-resourced companies like Meta's Instagram and Google's YouTube. The private messaging aspects of platforms like Instagram, which are largely not moderated at all, tend to be where a lot of these type of sextortion cases take place, not just for young people, but for adults and as well. And so I think that seeing what platforms the kids are gravitating to the most, and how these platforms are trying to even further capitalize children's attention, even by trying to create platforms for kids under the age of 13, is where regulators really should be looking to ensure that they're keeping children safe.
Thank you. I just want to move to Ms. Kerrigan because she joined us late. Disinformation and loss of trust. So the head of the CBC was in committee, Catherine Tate. Their organization, she's admitted, because they had in Toronto, they held a forum on loss of trust. So you have traditional media, loss of trust. She admitted that here. And now you're telling me social media. Who can you trust? I mean, right? Who can you trust these days? Anybody?
C'est une bonne question. Les données sur...
That's a good question. Data on trust show that in Canada, we're a bit more privileged than other democratic countries. We have a better trust level than other countries, so perhaps it's not as bad as all that. There is a loss of trust, nevertheless, with my colleague Marie-Françoise Vernier. We carried out a study in 2023 regarding Canadians' interaction with media, and we saw that there was distrust regarding the independence of political players and the economy and so on. Mainstream media do have ethics to respect, and then you have these online journalists who have no sex ethics official anyway, to respect, and there might be a need to better define the difference for trust between the way mainstream media work and online influencers work who pretend to be journalists and confuse the public. Very often these are the influencers who really feed distrust. What we see at our chair is that whatever their ideology, influencers now tend to promote distrust of authority. They sort of pretend to be legitimate. They pretend, or present themselves at least, as being reliable sources of information, whereas everyone else is unreliable. And that's a trend across all influencers. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Heritage Committee. Glad to see you here. You now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. I'd like to start by, I think it was Mr. Cooper, if I heard correctly, I heard you speaking about eating disorders earlier. Am I right about that? And if
Yes,
so,
sir.
could I ask you to just speak about how prevalent eating disorders are and what the consequence of that is, to the extent that you can?
So as it pertains to the general population, about 10% of Canadians have high risk of eating disorders. And when we look at the 16 to 17-year-old population, it's approximately 21% have high risk of eating disorders on the ODESY screener. That is higher among young women. It's closer to a quarter of young women have a high risk of eating disorders. And when you do look at the social media specifically on that, the biggest indicator that is driving negative mental health is comparisons to others. So it is being driven significantly by social media. The other indicator that we typically look at is suicides, and we do see that there's an onset of these disorders. And so when you study these at the international level, where you start getting enough data, you do see that there's a high spike of eating disorder deaths in around that 15 to 17-year-old grouping, and actually risk significantly falls off after that. So if you're not addressing eating disorder issues at the 12 to 14, 15-year-old range, you're missing the vast majority of those who'd be affected by that.
Thank you very much for that. So full disclosure, I used to be a member of provincial parliament in Ontario, and I introduced a private member's bill on this very topic in 2017. I spoke with experts like yourselves and others on this topic, and Mr. Cooper, the stat, and this is back in 2017 from the National Initiative for Eating Disorders, was that an estimated 1 million Canadians had an eating disorder at that time, and that eating disorders have the highest death rate of any mental illness, that 1 in 10 people with eating disorders die from their disorder. Does that sound about right to you, Mr. Cooper, based on what you know?
Well, I've worked with NEED as well, the group you're talking about as well. So we worked with them on these studies. It is accurate. The challenge with it is there is not great death data for a lot of these indicators, so it's really hard to validate that. And certainly you can look at it from. It's hard to ascertain exactly how many people have an eating disorder. There isn't a really great tracker for it. So we use a risk screener, the ODESY, to actually ascertain the potential risk of it. And we're still, it's not a great screener, to be completely honest with you. But the numbers you're quoting, I have seen them. I have talked to them about them. They do seem correct to me, yes.
So how much time do I have left, Chair?
You're at 3 minutes. You have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. So based on that data from 2017, I'm just going to rely on that. If 1 million Canadians had an eating disorder in 2017 and 1 in 10 die from that disorder, that would be 100,000 Canadians would die from an eating disorder if those statistics bear out. So I'm sharing this only to say it's a big problem and it touches a lot of people, and very often I think people, for understandable reasons, this is something that's not talked about, but it's an element of what's been discussed at this committee that I think is really, really important for us to consider, I think. the private members bill I had, Mr. Cooper, at the time, and was endorsed by a bunch of folks in the sector, was the intention of the bill at the time was to require that commercial content, so paid content, advertising, commercial content that was in any way manipulated or distorted had to have a disclaimer on it so that people knew that the image was distorted. And the idea here was, specifically in the context of eating disorders, was that there were a lot of young people especially who would see images of beauty that are unattainable, and that would contribute to their eating disorder. At least that's what the experts told me, and that was the intention of the bill. So, Mr. Cooper, I don't know if you have thoughts on that type of measure, but I would welcome your thoughts on that measure or any types of measures that you would recommend to help us deal specifically with how social media is influencing young people in the context of eating disorders.
So again, I'll point to data that suggests that it's not just about seeing these ads, it's the volume and the number you consume. So if you're consuming a lot of ads over a period of time, you start actually seeing that this is where the numbers of high depression, high issues of comparing yourself with others. So it's about not just getting that one ad, it's about getting the dozens of ads, because the algorithm will keep feeding you those sorts of pieces. It's like you get one bad thing, people click with things that not just they like, but that they're also are making them feel bad. And then that just starts a doom scroll of getting more and more and more of these negative sort of contents on this front. I'm not a policymaker, so it would be hard for me to say exactly what we could do to address this particular issue. There is an inherent need to want to compare yourself, and we do have lots of research about why young people specifically want to engage in that sort of activity. It's a part of growing up. It's a part of I'm trying to understand myself, my own body. I'm trying to understand these things, and it's really taking advantage of those sorts of things. But I think the other piece that you didn't mention that is critically important is the generation of wealth and profit as a result of these sorts of activities as well. So a lot of these are not just showing these images, but they're generating money by actually being able to say, I'm selling this makeup, I'm selling this product, and it's a revenue generator. So not only are they showing these influencers are doing this, they're making money off these young people who are starting to have body dysmorphia and other issues, which is quite frankly atrocious.
Very good point. Thank you. Mr. Giot, you now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. This is to Ms. Paul. I was very fascinated when you talked about Meta and Google being aware of the harms they're doing to kids and actually profiting from it. You also mentioned there's widespread drug trafficking on Instagram. Could you go into that a little bit more and tell us how it's done and your concerns and how you track it and so forth?
Well, when it comes to Instagram, there are several different studies we've done focusing on the drug trafficking on that platform. For instance, we created a teen user that searched for things like the word Xanax, and before even fully typing, Meta's autofill recommendations would recommend accounts called Xanax for sale, buy Xanax, things like that would just feature profile photos full of pills. It took very little effort for teen users to connect on the platform. I think it's important to keep in mind that the way that these companies profit is through advertising, and the way that they can get more spend on ads is to keep eyeballs as long as possible. That's why you see things like AI slop proliferating, because that is one of the ways to keep people just looking at the platform, whether it's in disbelief, whether it's in shock, or whether it's in genuine interest. When it comes to the advertising mechanisms, Meta's ad library is one of the ways that we've been able to look at the drug trafficking ads. And we actually have a running hashtag on our X account, hashtag #MetaDrugAds, where we frequently post videos and photos of the ads while they're actively running after they've been approved by Meta. I think the important thing to remember here is even when the company's executives go before committees like yours and say that that's not allowed and they remove those ads after they become aware of it, they don't refund the drug dealers, they keep the money, and they clean up after they've been caught. There are also several whistleblowers recently regarding issues to children that have come out from Meta. There was a congressional hearing a few months ago where two whistleblowers that were tasked with internal investigations regarding harms to children detailed how the companies very narrowly directed what they were allowed to research, how they were allowed to write their reports, and what they couldn't research, even though they knew that that was causing harm to children. Those are things that are also important to keep in mind. But the advertising mechanism is very important. One of the things about the Meta ad library is that ads that are not labeled as political are only viewable while they are actively running. The exception to this is that in the European Union, thanks to the Digital Services Act, that law has required Meta to leave every ad that runs in the platform available for view in the ad library for a year. That is one of the ways we were able to see the scale of drug trafficking ads on the platform, because at any given time, there is such a high volume of ads, the average researcher is not going to be able to simply scroll and see them. But because Meta now is required by law in Europe and in the UK now as well as a result of the Online Safety Act to keep those ads in the library for a year, we can actually see the scale of the harm they're creating and the fact that they profit from that content directly and don't remove those ads in many cases and let them run to completion.
You've seen illegal activity. Do you report this to law enforcement?
Our organization is a open source research and investigative organization. Reporting these to law enforcement, in many cases, these are outside of U.S. jurisdiction if they're users in foreign countries. One of the things to keep in mind is that many of these drug trafficking ads or weapons trafficking ads direct users to a private encrypted messenger as opposed to a clothing website. And one of the things with regard to those messengers that we've seen is that in some cases, Telegram, for instance, whose CEO was recently arrested in France, is actually moderating more effectively before Meta ever takes down the ad. So you can go to a Telegram account that is in an ad and that is actively running and has already been removed for violating, but Meta is continuing to collect money from the ads actually promoting that harmful content. Those Telegram accounts are not able to reach users. They're not searchable on the platform. They have to buy that reach from Meta. So in these scenarios, Meta is the kingpin. And any whack-a-mole of these individuals, their ability to reach a broad swath of the North American population is only possible because of the failures in moderation by Meta on its advertising platform.
Your solutions to this, top three, perhaps?
Well, I think for any country where Meta is operating, and that is pretty much every country in the world, regulations from national bodies are incredibly important, and particularly holding the companies accountable, not just for algorithmically promoting illegal content, but for actively profiting from it. Meta is a facilitator in this trafficking process and not just a passive host. They've said ads are 97% of the way that the company makes its revenue. In any other world, the quality control of a product at this rate would bankrupt a company, but we've seen no repercussions for Meta, and so they're allowed to continue collecting millions of dollars from explicitly illegal content that you could never see on a news station, in a newspaper, on a television station. And at the very least, starting with their main profit mechanism and how that is being driven by illegal content is critical to beginning to get these platforms moderating more effectively and following the law.
Thank you.
Mr. Miles, you have the floor now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. Fascinating testimonies today and really well delivered. Seems to me, I just want to continue on the regulation conversation that MP Diot was just speaking about, because it seems to me that there's kind of three elements here now. We have, the possibility to regulate access, which they've done in Australia. Nobody under 16 has access. Or there's regulating the content. We've talked about certain users, certain influencers being considered, too dangerous or whatever, trying to regulate the content from that side. Or there's regulating the algorithm. So it's access, content, or the algorithm itself, how it behaves. Because it has changed. I thought that Mr. Bridgman's, you're speaking of suggested content and what you've been speaking about, Ms. Paul, about advertising. We know the behaviors of these algorithms. Do you sometimes feel that the access question is a cop-out? by saying you can't touch it, so we got to just say no one can use it. I guess I'm trying to figure out what the right balance is here, because it is obviously very disconcerting. I have young kids. Sometimes I want to say no access, but at the same time, I'm looking at the inside, looking at that algorithm and going, well, at the same time, why can't we regulate how that algorithm behaves? Because we know it's driving people towards radicalization. We know it's causing these are facts that we know through academic study after academic study. Screen time alone and the relationship to mental illness, addictiveness of the algorithm. So where do you think our weight is best placed from a regulatory perspective on access or content or on the algorithm itself? Maybe I can start with Mr. Bridgman.
This is an excellent question. Thank you for it. So for the platforms, they are here. They are widely popular. They are widely used by Canadians. Cutting off access, maybe for under 18s, maybe we'll see how that plays out in Australia. I think what I've said and what others have said or hinted at as well is that you can tune these algorithms to reduce harms. That is possible. That is a governable fact. That is an available policy option. So to take sort of the we've talked a lot about today, the drug example on Facebook. We saw during the last federal election many sort of AI slop ads using political content that were being promoted, that were political ads during the campaign. We ran a very small audit study using sort of vision models. Is this political? This is during an election campaign, so it's governed speech, so there's particular rules that apply. The vision model can easily identify it. These tools are widely available. What is not being done is that there is not some pressure put on these platforms to apply that vision model effectively, to ensure that the engineering and staff capacity time is put towards that. And so we have to turn that dial. We have to make it more expensive, more costly. And there are ways to tune this. There are ways to work with the platforms and say, look, this is not going to work. We're going to start imposing fines in this space. So you run an ad that shares drug content, not only can you not profit from that ad, but all of the revenue there is going to be applied and is going to be taxed as a fine. If you apply the right lever, the company will change very quickly the amount of resources internally it's devoting to this. And so the approach of the DSA, a harms-based approach that says we're going to identify harms on the platforms. Platforms are responsible for proactively identifying harms, and we're going to use those levers. We're going to try to reduce that amount of harm. They operate in probabilistic ways. Those of you who kind of are experiencing sort of the new AI wave, this is all probabilistic. And we can play with those probabilities and we can pose fines and adjust those probabilities in the favor of reducing online harms, in the favor of protecting children, in the favor of a better democratic discourse. And that's all possible.
Has that been done in other jurisdictions?
I mean, absolutely. This is what the DSA is doing. This is, to a certain extent, what C63 kind of proposed and was trying to do. And yeah, absolutely. There's criticism of that and there's space for that. But that was the approach, is to try to reduce that harm calculus and to force, like, these decisions, we cannot think of these companies as engaging in evil behavior. They are pursuing their advertising, maximizing. And that is great. And we say, okay, yeah, that's good. And you are free to do that and to profit from that. And that is great. Here are the rules for our society. Here are the rules. Here are the harms we are okay with. Here are the harms we are not okay with. And here's how we're going to push you in that direction. And in fact, that is the purpose of government. That is the purpose of regulation, is to do that.
Et peut-être je vais demander la même question à Madame.
And perhaps I could put the same question to Ms. Carignan. Do you have anything to add? Inaudible to the interpreter, I'm afraid. The microphone needs to be turned on. Yes, we need the microphone. Good, thank you. I agree with what my colleague has just said. I think that these options should be taken into consideration or under consideration, and that financial penalties tends to work for such platforms. Money speaks, at least for them. So there are other approaches. You mentioned access, content, and algorithm. As for the content now, it's easy enough to prevent hateful content, to legislate regarding such material online, things that affect our rights and freedoms under the Charter. You need to frame disinformation and locate content which are problematic, that are violent and hateful, hate speech and so on. It's easy enough to block that. We saw this during COVID-19. There were specific accounts that were shut down because they were hateful and ideologically unacceptable. And since then, these platforms have been reopened and are up and running again. It depends a lot on the type of platform you're dealing with. And also, you mentioned in the environment, the efforts to point out positive content. For example, Mark Zuckerberg of Meta said recently that fact-checking is politically dangerous and prevents free speech. That's totally wrong. It doesn't block content. It just points to reliable content from true journalism that's authentic and so on. So I think we need to focus on such approaches as that as well, to support content that is provided by internationally recognized journalistic groups, scientific groups. Platforms are able to push appropriate content, suggesting reliable, trustworthy content. It's not to block content, it's to offer alternative content so that people are shown appropriate material. And it's been shown that verifying works well to do that. So we need to focus on blocking hateful content, providing positive content, and favoring and supporting good algorithms. I agree with my colleagues that we do need algorithms that are set to block some hateful content with financial penalties. Thank you, Mr. Champoux. 2.5 minutes. We mentioned C63. I think it's unfortunate when C63 was on the table, we suggested to break it down into two sections to ensure that everything having to do with harm to children be carried. There was consensus for that, but for the government at the time, there was not, a possibility. But we could have gone ahead had we been able to block it down, to break it down, and it's unfortunate we didn't. Ms. Carignan, you have mentioned a number of initiatives, media literacy initiatives that have been proposed by groups such as Les Aides à l'Information, Information ACEs, if you wish. And I think these are good initiatives. What I think is unfortunate, and as a father of young adolescents, what I do find truly unfortunate is that there doesn't seem to be a mandate, at the schools at least, to educate young people in media literacy. Teach them to remain vigilant and aware of disinformation and misinformation. I've never heard my children come home from school and said, look, I learned this about, learning what is false news and so on, and I have some good ways to detect misinformation online. So why aren't we more proactive at school? Here's the issue. Education is often considered to be a cross-cutting competency, and nevertheless, people teaching at school aren't necessarily trained in media literacy, how to teach this to youth. So they need tools to be able to teach youth this, and this is what the group La Désinformation does. They provide teachers with tools to help youth learn how to access appropriate information. So we do have a research with other groups, Science Presse, for example, showing that this works in the immediate, medium, and long term. People who have been exposed to this training become better informed about the comparison between influencer content and journalistic content. They're better able to evaluate information sources. Doesn't mean that they'll necessarily stop consuming problematic issues, but at least they're aware that there are alternatives. And such initiatives would be a good idea to make them more available. Unfortunately, these journalists doing this on a volunteer basis, and we know that we haven't enough journalists to cover this sort of approach. So without adequate information for youth, would it be a good solution to do what Australia is doing, simply to restrict access to social media until we're able to teach proper media literacy? Should we do one, the other, or both at the same time? All right, I think that among the very young, restriction is a good idea, but by the time you're 16, nearly 18, they do need some access and some media literacy. What are they going to do? They'll suddenly be exposed to all this, and they won't be able to apply a critical view of or gaze on social media. So I don't think that blocking is necessarily the right solution. We need to focus on literacy, on education. So we need some legal structuring and management of access. There are discussions of VPNs. Of course, some young people go through their parents' accounts and circumvent the blocks on the platforms for youth. So it's difficult as well to tell for parents what they should be exposed to and what they shouldn't. I really think we need to use education and media literacy. So the market with young people, or working with young people to ensure that they do become educated, perhaps this is the right approach. We do see research among young people who are able to access proper data, share this with their families. Our research shows that if youth are able to learn how to access reliable information, they can actually inform their parents of it, and that has an effect on parents who are uninformed about, let's say, migration or climate change. As well, it's easier for families to discuss difficult issues once children learn how to access correct information. That often goes through students. We have a chair at UQAM via Stéphanie Tremblay, for example, who is working on how to discuss sensitive issues in classrooms and in families, and I would encourage this sort of approach.
You have 5 minutes or so.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I do, Ms. Paul, my question is going to be directed to you first, and that is this. I want to kind of get your thoughts on what is the solution in terms of properly regulating platforms to be able to prevent this type of behavior. Because based on what I'm hearing from you, it doesn't matter if the public is outraged. It doesn't matter if organizations like your own are doing the necessary research and reporting. These things don't seem to be doing it. There is still illicit material reaching the eyeballs of youth, and then in the case of ordering illicit drugs, then reaching their hands, and then of course having an impact on their lives. So what is it that we as legislators need to know in terms of how to potentially regulate these tech giants to generate change and ultimately protect people who are under the age of 18?
Well, I think, getting to some of the questions that we've just been hearing regarding the age verification laws, one of the things that's important to keep in mind about that is that companies like Meta have heavily promoted that as a solution, which should be suspicious because of the fact that all it does is pass the responsibility onto kids, onto their families, and away from the platform for the fact that it is directly profiting from harm. And it also takes the responsibility off of the platform to invest in any sort of moderation, quality control of its main product, which is advertising. We don't see any of these levers being used. It's gone so far as for some of these platforms, we're seeing direct sanctions violations because they are so heavily operating without any sort of oversight. They're actually profiting from sanctioned entities for things like advertisements and subscriptions, sanctioned individuals who use their full name listed in OFAC lists. And this is because these companies have been able to operate with complete impunity for over a decade now. Passing the buck of responsibility to parents, and keeping in mind, not every kid has parents who are going to understand how to use social media. Not every kid has has parents that are able to be involved in their lives. Some kids have grandparents who may have never even seen one of these platforms before. Again, it's all passing the buck of responsibility from these companies failing to do their job and quality control of their product. And starting there with their product, which is advertising, and ensuring that that is controlled is one of the critical pieces, because that is their main financial lever. And that's one of the things that's going to force further moderation so that they're not incurring fines or regulatory financial burdens that are going to harm their business model. And so looking from the top down, which is where the money starts, I think is one of the most critical pieces toward any successful regulation. Obviously, the DSA has been mentioned several times. That's something that is new regulation, but the fact that the companies have pushed back so heavily on it, and again, this is not, the DSA is not meant to police speech on these platforms. It's targeting illegal activity, terrorism, and the fact that the companies are pushing that hard to even, have the U.S. president do things like threaten tariffs against Europe for imposing the DSA suggests that any sort of regulation is effective in a way that the companies are not willing to comply with, because it will require them to give up profits they've been making from harmful content. And so starting with the profit-driving mechanisms is one of the most critical ways to have effective enforcement in any country. And just looking at how these companies react to the threat of enforcement, I think, is a really important measure for understanding where the pressure points are.
Okay. No, I can appreciate that. Is there anything, like, in many ways that's a fairly general answer, are there specific pressure points that should be applied through legislation to be most effective?
Well, I'm not as familiar with the way the legislative process works in Canada, so I wouldn't feel comfortable speaking to that. But I think, utilizing laws on the books and imposing fines for companies profiting from already illegal activity is a very easy first place to start, but also looking at models that are happening in Europe and the UK, where they are imposing online safety protocols in a way that the companies are clearly unwilling to meet. For instance, Meta has announced that it's going to stop running political ads in Europe simply because it's unwilling to make an effort to moderate its platform in a way that complies with reasonable regulations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, one of the things that you talk about in an article that is within your sphere, this quote is made: Meta can keep certain illegal material off its platform, specifically images depicting child sexual abuse. The company is completely capable of doing this. It has the technology to address these issues. It's a choice at this point to not do so. So if Meta is technologically capable of detecting and removing these types of things, trafficking, what explains their lack of action in this case then?
The failure of any sort of repercussions, financially, civil, or legally. Without repercussions, there is no incentive for the company to invest in moderation. The years prior to 2020, for instance, where they really touted that they were investing in more content moderators and trust and safety, thousands of people that they've since laid off, they were doing because there was just the threat of U.S. regulation at the time. Unfortunately, we have not seen that regulation come yet. So in the meantime, the companies have decided to lay off thousands of those moderators and not invest in the types of safety because simply there's nothing stopping them from not doing so.
So then essentially, if regulations are to be put in place or legislation is to be put in place, to have teeth, it would have to impose a monetary penalty, a significant monetary penalty to these tech organizations in order to see change. Is that a correct understanding then?
A monetary penalty or a penalty of any kind. I mean, I think that incorporating the fact that there is illegal activity that the average person, if they were, as it was asked if we work with law enforcement, the people running these ads for drugs and weapons would get arrested, I'm assuming in Canada, they would certainly get arrested in the US, but the company that's profiting the most from running the ads in the first place is facing no repercussions either legally or financially. And so I think any sort of repercussions for profiting from that kind of behavior and the facilitation of those crimes is a very base level place to start. And then from there, again, I'm not as familiar with Canada's legislative process, but from there, understanding more abstract concepts like what defines hate speech, what defines disinformation, but starting with the illegal content, because that's where we are, is that these companies are running ads for drugs, weapon, and fraud.
Makes me wonder about enforcement given the prevalence of all this harmful content, but I will pass the floor over to Mr. Miles for 5 minutes.
Okay, so we're still going. Thank you very much. I'll just quickly ask, is there any concern about regulating in the ways we've been talking about, but then at its core, again, I am still concerned about the addictiveness of the actual algorithm. I mean, again, like we have ads, we have the content on it that are concerning, but there is something to be said about the idea that even without ads, it is designed to pull you in and to, again, you aren't choosing those things. I think that's, to me, that doesn't go away, even with these regulations. Or maybe are there ways, are people looking at ways to actually address that element of the concern for those of us who have kids who are using these things and worried about the screen time and their ability to pay attention for long periods of time. I mean, it certainly has it affected my ability to pay attention for a long time. I scroll all the time. I'm as guilty as anybody on these things.
Well,
Allez-y.
sorry.
Non, allez-y, je vous en
I'm
prie.
sorry, I didn't direct the question. Monsieur Morin, pour commencer, oui.
Oui.
Yes,
C'est ça.
yes, I'm happy to begin. Yes, of course, this is a considerable issue, but let me just jump around here. You saw this morning in the news that 25 years down the road, an article was pulled from a scientific journal that had shown the negative effects of glucosate, and this had been written not by the scientists who said that they had, but by a company that was paid them to publish it. So let's go back to the tobacco industry. This was a poor corporate citizen, and it was necessary. And I remind you, as MPs, imagine that you had been MPs 25 years ago. With the information that you now have about the negative effects of tobacco, what would you do? But what the experts say today is that we have or see the same level of negative effect and harm from continuous exposure to negative social media as the harm created by the tobacco industry. Therefore, it's important to do something now, and you have to start somewhere. So with the tobacco industry, of course, studies were carried out, but you remember they said specifically doubt is our product. So their work consisted of making people believe that, given the doubts, it was complicated, it wasn't that clear, etc., that no one should do anything. So we will indeed need to work on addiction to the algorithm. I think that this also picks up on the question that was put by another MP a little earlier. What is the most dangerous content that we do want to get out of the market? Is it child sexual abuse material? Is it promotion of violence and hate and so forth? And then we need to ask these platforms and enforce, actually, obligation, and C63 did so. It asked that these firms provide a protocolar report every year that would be reviewed by the commissioner on social media's, security and safety, that could impose financial and monetary penalties on them. So we do need more work on addiction to social media, but that said, we need to act now. Thank you very much.
You wanted to interject as well? Sorry.
Yeah, I think one of the things with regard to algorithms, and keeping in mind that we're focusing, this hearing is to focus on children, right? Algorithms are not there to help you, to help me, to help children. They're there to help advertisers and the companies profiting from the ads. When Facebook first started in 2004, it didn't have algorithms. You followed your friends and the feed was chronological. It didn't introduce its first algorithm until 2006. The company has increased those algorithms and the kind of content it recommends so that it can maximize profit, not so that it can suggest things that are useful to users. We know from multiple Facebook whistleblowers that the company uses algorithms that push toward increasingly divisive and extreme content because they're the most likely to get engagement. Engagement means you're on the platform longer, and that means they can charge more for ads. And I think it gets back to the business model of these platforms and understanding that kids do not need algorithms to operate on a social media platform. The platforms need the algorithms to keep kids' eyeballs on them. And I would encourage your committee to interview the whistleblowers from Meta that were speaking before Congress just a couple months ago, because they specialized on harms to children based on the platform's designs and algorithms, and were directed by the company to only investigate certain things and not things that were going to harm the business model. They've detailed this in their testimonies, but I think it is important for the MPs to hear this from the Meta whistleblowers themselves.
Very helpful. Thank you for both those answers. They were tremendous. Thank you.
It's so interesting. I know Mr. Genereux would like another short time. We have another 15 minutes, so we'll do 3-3-2. Does that work? Mr. Genereux, 3 minutes.
Okay, ben merci. 3 minutes, Mr. Genereux. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So chatting with my colleagues here and listening to you carefully, kind witnesses, and you're all excellent, by the way, providing very, very interesting answers. In some other countries, legislation has been adopted. For example, Australia, if I'm not mistaken. Could you please tell us what countries, in your opinion, have brought in helpful legislation or taken regulations now applied that are useful? Could you give us some examples? And linked to that, you are excellent witnesses, so I'm asking you this question. We have added 2 additional meetings to carry out the study. We might be able to hear other witnesses, perhaps lawmakers in other jurisdictions, other countries, or perhaps specialists who contributed to writing up the legislation that you would recommend to us. So I'd like to say, both to Ms. Paul and to those of you here, could you perhaps provide us with some names, some suggestions, people who are lawmakers who helped write up the new legislation used in other countries and so on? Well, yes, we had met them when we drew up or actually discussed C63 and our opinions about it. There's the UK commissioners, the Australian one as well, and the European Union as well. These are the countries who have moved most on this. The EU Digital Act, Digital Services Act, it took a while to get that in. I'm not sure exactly what data they based that on, or we have on its effect. For Australia, we'll be looking for data on the block on social media used by children under 16 years of age. That'll be very interesting. So there is a lot of data about some of the effects of this legislation, and you could find that information. Ms. Carignan and Mr. Brigman. Yes, I agree with Mr. Morin that the United UK, Europe, and Australia are models to look into, and that these legislation haven't been adopted elsewhere, the platforms are under some pressure due to that fact. If we're able to say that, look, this is working elsewhere, this has been applied elsewhere, so we can do this as well to you. It's good then that these other countries, these other legislations have brought in this legislation, given that platforms now will have to back off on the inability to do this. Pierre Trudel, who's a specialist in media legislation, will be able to tell you more about how these measures can be applied or are being applied in Quebec. I know another issue that was discussed with regard to framing the behavior of the platforms is setting up an observatory, a research section that could keep an eye on the new trends. So that's another idea, how one could set up a research group that increases prevention and information. Mr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cooper, I made reference to parasocial relationships earlier, and I've asked you so many questions, I'm sure this is starting to look like one. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm curious, you spoke of the harmful impact of excessive screen time. Increasingly, screens are part of everyday lives. That is at school, that is everywhere we go. How should Canada balance screen time guidelines with the reality that schools, social life, extracurriculars now operate online?
Well, first off, thank you for your question. I want to address that it is an addictive behavior, as your colleague indicated as well. And one thing we know is one addictive behavior can actually be a catalyst for another addictive behavior. So we do see, for example, individuals who are spending 6 hours plus on screen time are twice as likely to have be showing at high risk for alcohol consumption or cannabis consumption or a host of other addictions that and this really does come down to how it can break down your ability to regulate yourself in the face of these addictive sort of properties. I think what I would necessarily work on is we don't have really good, as your colleague also indicated, really good social media or even media literacy anymore. In Ontario, he indicated there wasn't any. In Ontario, we have it in grade 10, but this is terribly outdated. We know that youth are consuming these sorts of content significantly younger than 14, which is grade 10. So I think the first thing we can do is we could start introducing literacy at younger ages, because and explicitly in curriculums. I do agree with that comment, but it has to be younger. I do also believe very strongly that we're not going to beat all these social media companies. We're not going to be successful with one avenue of simply trying to remove access. We're not going to be successful because individuals are going to find a way to get access to those sorts of things. So a combination of reducing access so that they don't have the ability to do it 6+ hours a day, a combination of supporting digital literacy campaigns as well. And I do agree with my colleague about trying to find ways to demonetize. Especially, I know the algorithm functions in a way that allows them to have local tweaks to countries and even on regional levels as well too. So there's no reason whatsoever that they couldn't have a Canadian-specific version that would necessarily. We could identify a group of particularly harmful activities. We could identify that it's primarily targeting younger adults. On a lot of these social media platforms, you can't target children, but you can target 18 to 24, and that same group would overlap with a lot of these youth that would have this content. So you could find ways to actually micro-target it to say like 18 to 24 on issues around anything that might lead to body dysmorphia. So makeup tutorials. You could create a categorizations of things that would necessarily be demonetized in some way in Canada. So if you put a suite of things together like that, that's your best option for actually addressing these, because you're not going to get it down to zero. And from my perspective, it's really about trying to remove that exceptional 6 hours plus that individuals and young people are getting, or even 3. There's risk factors at over 4 hours, getting it down below that threshold.
Thank you very much. Mr. Champoux, 2 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We have wonderful witnesses here today. Thank you for your presence. I have the impression that society has allowed for years hate speech and its proliferation and not been regulating social media platforms. We've perhaps reached a point at which we really have to go at this with a really big weapon, and we're not going to be able to do this unless we all work at it together. Don't you think we've reached the point where we need to hold our ground and set in an independent commission, pretty much like what was done for the future of telecommunications and so on, the reports at the end of the 2018, 2019 back then? Isn't it time to say, look, let's take a step back, let's take a good look at this, let's really study this in depth to see how we wish to position ourselves with respect to these important issues that will have a serious effect on our society going forward? What do you think? I think that it's time to take action. There are a number of studies, a number of experiments actually, in a number of countries, but even in the United States, many of the states themselves have looked into this. There's a good deal of information available. Yes, it's time to move forward in a big way. And if that's the best way to do it, then let's just do it. But we really need to move fast and furious, because everyone else is working on this. But we here in Canada, I have the impression that, like, we're sort of trying to get our minds around it, but we're not really getting anywhere. And right now, young people are insufficiently protected. Minors aren't protected. That's where we're at, and we need to do something about it. Yes, I agree. We're saying, you know, you have to go at it bit by bit, but we need to go fast and furious. And we certainly can use models that are working elsewhere to move forward. We can perhaps work with other countries, learn from their best practices. We need to operate at two levels: immediately to help youth avoid this harmful material that has been discussed today, and then on the other side, we need a broader approach to content surveillance, setting up preventive measures, and continue to gather data. As colleagues were saying, we haven't enough data about youth behavior online. We need to operate on both those fronts, so it's important to set up, indeed, ongoing research and also work quickly.
Witnesses today. This has been an excellent, very interesting panel. We've learned a lot. If there is anything that you haven't mentioned or anything you weren't able to get on the record or anything you think of later, please send it to us via the clerk. We can use that as we discuss this study and as our analysts put together a report for us. So thank you again for your time, and this meeting is now adjourned.